Welcome back to Whispers of Time. Tonight, we're not just stepping into history, we're stepping into the very moment history began. Long before cities, before language, before fire itself, there was a single sound, stone striking stone. And in that sound, humanity was born. So, settle in. Phone down, lights low. Let the modern world fade away as we return to a time when a simple stone changed everything. This is the story of how a stone became a tool and how a tool created us. Close your eyes for a moment if you'd like. Imagine yourself standing on a vast open plain. The sun is high and merciless. Around you stretches an endless expanse of golden grass, dotted here and there, with acacia trees that seem to float like dark islands in an amber sea. The air is warm, almost heavy, and it carries the sound of distant life, the calls of birds you don't recognize, the rustle of movement through the grass. This is the African savanna roughly 4 million years ago, the world as it was before your kind walked upright, before tools, before anything we might call civilization. You stand still, listening. The landscape around you is alive in a way modern Africa, even the wild reserves we know today, is not. This world is older. It is rawer. Every creature still living here has not yet learned to fear the two-legged apes that are only beginning their slow, uncertain journey toward dominance. The savanna does not know yet that these creatures will one day reshape the earth. If you were truly standing here, you would feel small. The predators that walk this land are magnificent and deadly. Lions with manes like crowns move through the grass with the confidence of creatures that know no rival. Hyenas, their bodies powerful and their jaws capable of crushing bone, hunt in organized packs. Leopards, sleek and patient, wait in the trees. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, there are crocodiles in the water, their eyes barely above the surface, ancient and patient. The early ancestors of humans who lived in this world were not apex predators, they were prey. Or perhaps more accurately, they were survivors in a landscape where every moment carried the potential for death. They were small-bodied compared to many of the creatures around them. They were slower than the carnivores that hunted them. They had no claws, no fangs designed for tearing flesh, no armor of scales or thick hide. What they had was something less immediately useful, but ultimately far more powerful. A growing brain and hands that were beginning to become more skilled at grasping and manipulating the world around them. The hominins of this era, and we must use this careful scientific term to describe creatures who were neither quite ape nor quite human, lived a precarious existence. They moved through the landscape in small groups, probably family units of perhaps 15 to 30 individuals. The young children would have stayed close to their mothers because to wander was to invite death. An adult, alone, separated from the group, would have had perhaps minutes before a predator noticed the vulnerability and acted. This was a world without mercy. This was a world of immediate consequences. What did these early hominins eat? The evidence suggests they were omnivores, opportunistic feeders, taking nourishment wherever they could find it. Fruits and nuts which grew seasonally and required them to move across the landscape in search of abundance. Plants and tubers dug from the earth with their bare hands or with sticks that had not been shaped or worked, merely used as they were found. And meat, though not hunted meat, not yet, scavenged meat. Picture this scene. Somewhere on the savanna, a lion has made a kill. It has brought down a large hoofed animal, perhaps an antelope or a wildebeest. The lion, satisfied with its meal, has eaten its fill and rests nearby, digesting. And then, at a distance, a group of hominins catches the scent on the wind. They communicate somehow. We don't know if they used words or gestures or simply instinctive vocalizations. And they move carefully, always alert, always ready to flee. They approach the carcass and feed quickly, taking what the lion has left. The hide is still difficult to penetrate. The marrow in the bones is locked away. But there are softer tissues, parts of the meal that are more accessible to creatures without sharp tools. This scavenging was dangerous. It meant risking confrontation with the lion, with hyenas, with other predators, drawn by the same opportunity. But it was also tremendously valuable because meat provided calories, and calories meant survival. The question that haunted the early hominins was not one of philosophy or meaning. It was simply, where is the next meal and how do I survive long enough to find it? The world of 4 million years ago was also a world of seasonal extremes. In some parts of the African continent, the rains would come in torrents, transforming the dry savanna into a landscape of temporary abundance. Grass would grow thick and green, water would collect in depressions and pools. The herbivores that predators hunted would gather in larger numbers, and the predators themselves would become more active, their hunting more successful. But then the rains would stop. The grass would wither and die, the water sources would shrink and disappear, and the landscape would become again a place of scarcity. The early hominins learned to navigate these seasons through deep instincts, the instincts of creatures who had survived this cycle for countless generations. Their bodies learned the patterns. Their social structures evolved to maximize their chances of surviving the lean times. An individual alone could not survive a dry season on the savanna. A group, pooling their knowledge and their resources, had a much better chance. Daily life was probably organized around the search for food and the need for security. The day probably began with the rising sun. The night would have been dangerous, a time when certain predators hunted, when visibility was poor, when a creature without good night vision was at a severe disadvantage. So the early hominins probably retreated to higher ground as darkness approached, seeking shelter in trees if they could find them, or in rocky outcrops, places where a predator would have difficulty surprising them during sleep. Those who instinctively sought high ground, who stayed alert during the dangerous hours of darkness, would have survived more often and passed their traits to more offspring. As the sun rose, the group would descend and begin their day. There would be eating, if they had found food the previous day and somehow preserved it, or if they discovered a fruit tree now heavy with ripe fruit, or if they could find insects which are rich in protein. There would be movement across the landscape, sometimes following known routes to known food sources, sometimes exploring new territories, driven by hunger and the necessity of survival. There would be social interaction, grooming, the picking through each other's skin to remove parasites, a behavior that also served to cement social bonds. There would be play, especially among the young, and there would always be watchfulness, an ear turned toward a distant sound, eyes tracking movement at the edge of vision. Reproduction was central to survival in this era. Females of the species would have given birth to offspring, usually one at a time. The infants would be born extremely helpless, requiring years of care and protection before they could survive independently. The investment in each child was enormous. This shaped the family structure, the social bonds, the fundamental way these creatures organized themselves. Did something like culture exist? Did these early hominins have practices that they passed from one generation to the next, not through written instruction, but simply through observation and imitation? There is evidence that they used sticks to dig for tubers, though these sticks were not shaped or worked in any deliberate way. They simply found branches that had fallen and used them as they were found. When the stick broke, another was found. This was adaptation, the use of available tools, but we might hesitate to call it tool-making. Not yet. That would change. Around 3.5 to 2.5 million years ago, something new began to happen. In the archaeological record, stones began to appear that were clearly not natural. Stones that had been deliberately struck, creating sharp edges, stones that had been worked. These are the Oldowan tools, named after the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, where they were first identified by the pioneering archaeologists Mary and Louis Leakey in the 1930s. When you look at an Oldowan tool for the first time, you might not immediately recognize it as a tool at all. It looks crude, it looks rough, it looks almost accidental, as if a stone had simply been broken and nothing more. But that appearance masks something profound. Creating an Oldowan tool is not accidental. It required something that earlier hominins had not demonstrated: the recognition that a sharp edge could be created deliberately, and the ability to create that edge repeatedly, reliably, with intent. Imagine the first hominin who created one of these tools. Let's call this creature the maker, though we cannot know for certain what species they belonged to. The maker was perhaps standing or sitting on the savanna, holding a stone in one hand. This was not an unusual thing to do. Stones were everywhere. But the maker did something different. The maker struck the stone sharply with another stone, and a flake broke free. This flake, the piece that detached, was sharp, much sharper than anything that could be created by hand or with the blunt tools that might have been used before. And on the stone that remained, the core, a sharp edge had been created, an edge that could be used to cut, to scrape, to work. Did the maker immediately understand what had been created? Did this ancient mind grasp that a new kind of tool had come into being? Or was it accidental? Did the maker simply notice that the stone was now sharp and use it, and then learn through trial and error that striking stones in certain ways consistently produced this useful sharpness? We cannot know. But we do know this: someone figured it out. And once someone figured it out, the knowledge spread. It was passed from individual to individual, from generation to generation. Mothers showed their children. Older members of the group demonstrated the technique to younger ones. And within a few 100,000 years, a span of time, that, while enormous by human standards, is barely perceptible in geological time. Oldowan tool technology had spread across much of Africa. The advantages of these tools were genuine and transformative, though probably not in ways that were immediately obvious. The sharp flakes could be used to butcher meat much more efficiently than before. An animal that died of natural causes, or that was killed by a predator and then scavenged, could now be processed more effectively. The hide could be penetrated. The sinews connecting muscle to bone could be separated. The marrow in the bones, the most nutritious part, could be extracted. Food that had been wasted before because it couldn't be accessed could now be eaten. This matters more than it might initially seem. Caloric intake is one of the most fundamental determinants of survival and reproduction in any species. A hominin group that could extract more calories from a carcass could better survive the lean seasons. More individuals in the group could be fed, more children could be born and brought to maturity. The group would grow. Genetic material that included the capacity to create and use these tools would be passed to more offspring. Over many generations, this created a selection pressure. Those hominins who had the intelligence to understand tool making, the manual dexterity to perform it reliably, and the social capacity to learn from others and teach others, these individuals were more likely to survive and reproduce. The genes that supported these capacities spread through the population. But tools were not just about meat. They were also useful for processing plants. A sharp edge could be used to scrape seeds from grass. It could be used to work tubers and roots, making them easier to dig up and process. It could be used to fashion other tools from materials like bone and wood. If you have a sharp stone flake, you can take a wooden branch and shave it, sharpen it, make it into a digging stick far more effective than anything that had existed before. And here we arrive at something crucial. Tool making is cumulative. One tool can be used to make another tool. The simplest Oldowan flake could be used to sharpen a wooden digging stick. That wooden tool could then be used to dig more effectively, finding more tubers. The tubers could be eaten, providing the calories necessary for group survival. This is the beginning of a cycle, a feedback loop of improving technology and increasing capability. Once you step onto this path, it leads somewhere. It leads eventually to agriculture and civilization and the world as we know it. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us stay for a moment in this early epoch between 3 million and 1.5 million years ago, in a world where Oldowan tools have begun to spread, but where the hominins using them are still very much creatures of the savanna, still driven primarily by hunger and survival, still vulnerable to predators, still living in small groups, still without language as we would recognize it. What was the social world like? This is perhaps even harder to reconstruct than the physical lives of these early tool makers, but we can make educated guesses based on what we know about modern primates and what the archaeological record can tell us. The tool makers probably lived in groups, as earlier hominins did. These groups may have been somewhat larger than before, perhaps 30 to 50 individuals, with group size potentially being partly supported by the improved ability to process food that tools provided. The social structure was probably based on kinship, with family groups being the fundamental unit. There was probably a hierarchy, with some individuals being more dominant, more influential than others. This hierarchy was probably related to size and strength. Males were likely larger than females and likely dominated the group structure, but it may also have been related to skill, particularly skill at tool-making or hunting. Is there any evidence for culture in this period, for practices that were passed down, not instinctively, but through teaching and learning? This is genuinely uncertain. We know that tool-making techniques spread, but this could happen through simple imitation without any formal teaching. A young hominin watches an older one make a tool, and eventually, through trial and error, figures out how to do it themselves. No words are necessary, no intentional teaching, just observation and practice. And yet some patterns in the archaeological record suggest something more deliberate may have been happening. Oldowan tools show remarkable consistency across vast distances and over long periods of time. For hundreds of thousands of years, the technique remained essentially unchanged. This consistency could suggest that there was an intentional transmission of knowledge, that older tool makers were somehow ensuring that younger ones learned the correct technique. Or it could simply be that there is only a limited number of effective ways to strike a stone to produce a sharp flake, and hominins independently rediscovered the same techniques over and over. What we can say with confidence is this: by the time Oldowan tools had been in use for several 100,000 years, they had become ubiquitous in the African archaeological record. This is not a fluke. This is not a brief experiment with a tool that didn't work. This is the beginning of tool using as a fundamental part of what it means to be a hominin. This is the moment when our ancestors began their long journey toward the world we know today. While Oldowan tools were spreading across Africa, something else was happening as well. The hominins who made them were beginning to spread beyond the regions where they had originated. The archaeological record shows a gradual geographic expansion, a slow movement of tool-making populations across the African continent. Picture this expansion in your mind. It's not a rapid migration. There are no great journeys undertaken with specific destinations in mind. Rather, it's a gradual process of populations growing in one area and then slowly spreading into adjacent areas. Perhaps a family group becomes too large and splits. Part of the group stays in the traditional territory, part ventures into new land, and then that new group grows and splits and spreads further. Over thousands of generations, this slow process results in significant geographic expansion. Between approximately 2.5 and 1.5 million years ago, Oldowan tool-making populations spread from their origin points in the East African Rift Valley to other parts of East Africa, to South Africa, and eventually to West Africa. The process was probably slow and probably accompanied by adaptation to different environments. The savanna is not uniform. Different regions have different patterns of rainfall, different mixes of plant and animal life, different challenges for survival. In some areas, the environment was becoming drier, the savannas more open. In others, woodlands were still common. In still others, more temperate zones allowed for different patterns of living. The hominins who moved into these different areas probably found ways to adapt their tool-making to the resources available. The basic Oldowan technique remained, but variations appeared. Some tools were larger, some smaller. Some were suited better to certain tasks. This adaptability is itself significant. It suggests that the tool makers were not merely copying a technique that had been passed down unchanged. They were thinking about tools in a way that allowed them to modify them based on circumstances. They were not simply doing what they had always done. They were, in a real sense, problem-solving. The spread of tool-making populations across Africa also meant the spread of a more effective way of surviving. Populations with tools were better able to extract resources from their environment. They could process meat more efficiently, dig for tubers more effectively, work materials like wood and bone. These advantages translated into better nutrition, larger group sizes, better survival during lean times. The predators of the African savanna were still formidable during this period. Lions, hyenas, and leopards had not diminished in their prowess. If anything, they were becoming more dangerous as prey species became larger and more formidable. But the toolmakers had an advantage that their predecessors did not. If they killed a large animal or found a carcass, they could now process it efficiently. If they found a carcass, they could extract the maximum nutrition from it. Over the long term, this advantage mattered. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of increasing reliance on animal products. The bones of prey species accumulate in layers associated with Oldowan tools. The pattern of cut marks on the bones suggests that the meat was being systematically removed. The evidence suggests that toolmakers were becoming more effective at accessing meat, even if they were not yet hunting the animals they ate. They were still primarily scavenging from predator kills and hunting smaller, easier prey when possible. This shift toward reliance on animal products had profound implications. Plant-based diets, which earlier hominins had relied on, are available primarily seasonally. Meat is available year-round if you can access it. A population that could reliably access meat, even in modest quantities supplemented by plant foods, could survive the lean seasons better than a population that was entirely dependent on seasonally available plants. But with this new food source came new dangers. Hunting or scavenging large animals meant venturing into dangerous parts of the landscape. It meant potentially confronting predators over kills. It meant taking risks. But the rewards were sufficient to make it worthwhile. Evolution favored those who were willing to take these risks, those whose intelligence and courage and strength allowed them to access meat in sufficient quantities to feed their families. The social structures of these expanding populations probably became more complex as well. If you're hunting or scavenging large animals, you probably need cooperation. A single individual alone cannot bring down a large prey animal or effectively scavenge from a predator kill if other predators are present, but a coordinated group can, and coordination requires communication. However primitive, it requires a shared understanding of what needs to happen. It requires leadership and followership. It requires trust. Roughly 1.7 million years ago, though some evidence suggests it may have been as early as 1.25 million years ago, something remarkable happened in the archaeological record. A new tool type appeared, and it was so distinctive, so clearly the result of deliberate design, that it marks a cognitive leap comparable to the first appearance of Oldowan tools. These were handaxes, or bifaces as archaeologists more technically call them. An Acheulean handaxe, named after Saint-Acheulean in France, where they were first identified in the 19th century, is a stone tool that has been shaped not just on one side but on both sides. It is roughly teardrop-shaped, or sometimes more oval, tapering to a point at one end and broader at the other. It is held in the hand, hence the name, with the hand naturally gripping the broader, thicker end. The pointed end is sharp, the edges are sharp. It is a multi-purpose tool of remarkable sophistication. When you see a well-made Acheulean handaxe, you immediately recognize it as something different from the simple Oldowan flakes that came before. You can see the intention behind it. You can see that the toolmaker had a specific shape in mind, and that the tool was created deliberately to achieve that shape. This is not accident. This is not chance. This is design. The implications of this are profound. To create a handaxe, you must be able to envision the final product before you create it. You must understand the relationship between the material you're working with and the finished tool. You must be able to work toward a goal, striking the stone repeatedly, each strike calculated to move you closer to your vision. You must have what cognitive psychologists call mental synthesis, the ability to imagine something that doesn't yet exist and then create it through deliberate action. This is a kind of abstract thinking. It is not the same as observing an existing tool and copying it, though copying may have played a role in how the technique spread. Rather, it is the ability to hold an abstract idea in your mind and make it real. It suggests a kind of imagination, a kind of foresight, a kind of intelligence that is qualitatively different from what came before. The Acheulean technology, and it was more than just handaxes, there were specialized cutting tools, scrapers, and other implements, spread across Africa, and then it began to spread beyond Africa. Roughly 1.5 to 1.7 million years ago, handaxes began to appear in sites in the Middle East and Europe. The toolmakers who used them were spreading across vast distances, adapting to radically different environments. Who were these toolmakers? The best evidence suggests that they were members of the genus Homo, the genus to which modern humans belong. Specifically, most of the early Acheulean tools are associated with Homo erectus, a species that appeared roughly 1.9 million years ago and persisted until perhaps 117,000 years ago. Homo erectus was larger than earlier hominins, with a brain nearly as large as modern humans, with a bipedal gait that was fully upright, with long legs suitable for traversing large distances. But the most remarkable thing about Homo erectus was not any single anatomical feature. It was what they could do. They could make handaxes, they could migrate across continents, and crucially, they could use fire. Let us pause our chronological journey for a moment and inhabit the world of the Acheulean more fully. Let us imagine a specific day in the life of a group of Homo erectus, perhaps 800,000 years ago, in what is now Germany or southern France. The Ice Age climate of this period means that the landscape is cooler than it was in Africa, but not yet the frozen wasteland of the glacial maximum. There are forests of birch and pine mixed with open grasslands. Large herbivores roam the landscape: horses, rhinoceros, elephants with long, shaggy coats, massive deer. Our group numbers perhaps 25 individuals, adults and children, males and females. They have been living in a cave for the past season, a location they know well. It provides shelter from the elements and protection from predators. A spring of fresh water flows nearby. The cave was occupied by previous generations of their kind. There are blackened stones near the cave mouth that suggest fires have been lit here many times before. The day begins before dawn. One of the older males tends the fire that has been burning all night, carefully arranged so that it slowly burns through the long hours of darkness. As the sun begins to rise, he adds fresh wood. The fire flares up. Others begin to wake. Children emerge from the deeper parts of the cave where they were sleeping, wrapped in hides for warmth. The first activity of the day is eating. The remains of yesterday's meal, meat that has been preserved through the cool night, consumed now to provide energy for the day ahead. As the sun rises higher, some of the group begin to prepare for the hunt. This is not a random activity. There is planning involved, even if the plan is not articulated in words as we would understand it. They know that horses are moving through the grasslands to the east. They know from experience where the animals like to drink. They know from generations of accumulated knowledge what methods work best. The hunters, and at this time, hunting is probably primarily a male activity, though we should be cautious about assuming rigid gender roles, gather their tools, handaxes shaped and ready, spears with stone points, hafted to wooden shafts with some kind of adhesive, perhaps a resinous plant material, digging sticks which can be used as weapons or tools. They check their tools carefully. A loose haft on a spear could be dangerous. A dull edge on a handaxe could mean wasted effort. As they prepare, there is probably some communication. Gestures, certainly. Perhaps vocalizations, a mixture of pointing and sounds that constitute the closest thing they have to language. There is, almost certainly, an understanding of hierarchy, who will lead the hunt, who will follow, what each person's role will be. The hunters move out into the landscape. The journey takes hours. They are following game trails, reading signs in the ground and in the vegetation that tell them which direction the horses have gone. Their sense of smell is probably less acute than their ancestors, but their eyes are sharp and their minds are attentive. Late in the morning, they see the horses. A herd of perhaps 15 animals, moving slowly across a plain dotted with low shrubs. The hunters stop communicating silently. They crouch low, remaining as still as possible. The horses sense something, their ears swivel, their heads rise, but they don't bolt. The humans are upwind. There is no clear threat. Now the crucial moment. The hunters must decide. Do they attempt an active hunt, trying to surround the animals and bring one down, or do they wait and hope for an opportunity? The decision is made. It seems to be that one hunter advances slightly, then another. The movement is calculated to not immediately trigger panic. But horses are prey animals. They are sensitive to threat. These horses have learned over generations to recognize the danger posed by two-legged creatures with spears. They bolt. The herd scatters, moving quickly across the open ground. The hunt is on. The hunters run, their strong legs carrying them forward. They are not as fast as the horses, but they are faster than might be expected. And they have intelligence, something the horses lack. They attempt to cut off escape routes. They try to force the herd toward a place where the terrain is difficult, where an animal might slow or stumble. One horse is slightly slower, slightly weaker. Perhaps it's old, perhaps it's sick, perhaps it's just having an off day. But that is enough. The hunters converge, spears are thrown, not with the precision of modern athletes, but with the force of trained arms and intelligent aim. One strikes the animal's flank. It does not penetrate deeply. The hide is thick, but it wounds. The horse panics. It tries to escape, but it is slowing, weakened by the wound. The hunters close in. One uses a handaxe to strike from close range. Another throws another spear. The animal thrashes, desperate and terrified, and then finally it goes down. The hunters stand back momentarily. alert to the danger of a wounded animal's hooves and teeth. Then, as it becomes clear that the struggle has ended, they move in. What happens next is methodical. The hunters use their handaxes and flakes to cut into the carcass. They separate the hide from the body. They work to open the body cavity, accessing the organs. They use digging sticks to lever the bones apart, separating joints. The work is probably bloody and difficult. No modern tools exist. But these creatures understand the anatomy of horses because they have hunted them before, and they work efficiently. As the afternoon wears on, the carcass is butchered. The meat is divided. Much of it is probably wrapped in hides or arranged to be carried back to the cave. The bones are cracked and the nutritious marrow is extracted. Nothing is wasted. Everything that can be eaten is taken. The journey back to the cave takes several hours. The meat is heavy. The hunters move slowly, alert to the predators that the smell of blood and meat will have attracted. They pass through forests of conifers, emerging into open grassland. The sun is beginning to set as they arrive at the cave. The news of the successful hunt travels through the group quickly. There is an intensity of activity. The meat must be processed and stored. Fires are tended and stoked. The meat is probably consumed over the next few days. The hides are stretched and worked, beginning the long process of turning them into clothing or containers or other useful objects. The children watch all of this. They play with scraps. They observe the adults working. They are learning, without formal instruction, the vast accumulated knowledge that their society possesses. How to process an animal, how to use fire, how to make tools, how to navigate the landscape, how to function within the social group. Everything necessary for survival is being transmitted from one generation to the next through observation and imitation and probably some gentle guidance. As evening falls, the group gathers around the fires. The meat is cooked, cut into chunks and held over the flames until the exterior is seared and the interior is warm. It is eaten with probably some plant foods as well. Roots that were dug up and stored, berries gathered during the autumn. The meal is substantial and it is satisfying. After a day of hard work and danger, there is rest. The night is long and dark outside the cave, but inside the fires provide warmth and light. People huddle under hides for additional warmth. The very young sleep between adults for safety and heat. The older children and adolescents gather in groups. There is probably some kind of social interaction, possibly stories, if storytelling existed at this time, or at least some kind of communication about the hunt, about the near miss when one hunter almost fell, about the strength of the animal they killed. Predators prowl outside the cave through the night. We know this because bones of cave bears and lions have been found in the same archaeological sites, but they do not venture close. The fire is a barrier they understand and fear, and the humans, watchful and alert, maintain the fire through the night, ensuring that it does not die. This is life in the Acheulean world. It is a life of danger and exertion, but also of community, of technology, of purposeful action. The tools that these people carry are not just implements, they are the foundation of survival. They allow these creatures, who are slow compared to predators, weak compared to large prey animals, vulnerable compared to the other carnivores of the landscape, to persist, to thrive, to spread across continents. As we continue to follow the thread of human development, we must turn our attention inward to the transformation that was occurring inside the skulls of these ancient people. Because while the archaeological record shows us the tools they made and where they lived, it's the changes in their brains that ultimately made everything else possible. Homo erectus had a brain significantly larger than earlier hominins. An average Homo erectus individual had a brain volume of roughly 900 to 1100 cubic centimeters, compared to perhaps 400 to 500 for Australopithecus. The earlier hominin Homo habilis, who lived earlier, had a brain around 600 to 700 cubic centimeters. And while brain size is not the only factor determining intelligence or capability, it matters. A larger brain contains more neurons, more connections, more processing capacity, but size alone doesn't tell the story. What matters is how the brain was organized, how different regions were connected, what new capacities emerged. And here we see evidence of something remarkable. The brain of Homo erectus was becoming increasingly like a modern human brain. The prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain associated with planning, foresight, abstract thinking, and impulse control, was growing larger and becoming more connected to other regions. This was no accident. The selection pressures of the environment were favoring individuals with better planning abilities, better impulse control, better capacity for abstract thought. These individuals were more likely to hunt successfully, more likely to survive dangerous situations, more likely to pass their genes to offspring. Consider what is required to make an Acheulean handaxe. You must visualize the finished product before you begin striking the stone. You must understand the relationship between the stone material and the finished tool. You must execute a series of strikes, each one calculated to move the piece toward your mental image. You must adjust your approach based on how the stone fractures. You must have the patience to continue the work even when progress is slow. You must persist toward a goal even when the outcome is not immediately visible. These are not simple tasks. They require a level of abstract thinking, a capacity for mental synthesis that appears to have been a major innovation in the evolution of the human mind. Earlier, hominins could use tools, could even make simple tools through repetitive striking that eventually produced a usable edge. But the deliberate shaping of a tool to match a pre-existing mental image, this seems to be something new. Hand in hand with these neurological changes came changes in social organization and communication. A brain that could conceptualize abstract ideas would also have been capable of more sophisticated communication. Whether this communication took the form of early language, the ability to use arbitrary sounds to refer to objects and concepts and events, or remained more gestural and limited is genuinely uncertain among researchers. We simply don't have direct evidence from this period, but there must have been some advancement in the capacity to share ideas and coordinate actions. The success of hunting strategies, the consistency of tool-making across vast distances, the evidence of repeated use of the same cave sites, all of this suggests communication more sophisticated than what modern primates are known to produce. And with more sophisticated communication came the possibility of more effective teaching. An older, experienced toolmaker could explain to a younger person not just how to make a tool, but perhaps why certain techniques worked and others didn't. Knowledge could be shared more explicitly. Culture, in the sense of learned behaviors passed down through generations, could become more complex and more deliberately maintained. The evidence for this is somewhat indirect but suggestive. The consistency of Acheulean tools across vast geographic ranges and over hundreds of thousands of years suggests a level of cultural transmission that goes beyond simple imitation. The toolmakers who created handaxes in southwestern France were creating objects that were remarkably similar to those created by toolmakers in East Africa or the Middle East, despite having had no contact with each other. This level of consistency across such vast distances and time periods suggests that there was a shared understanding, a cultural template that was being faithfully reproduced from place to place and generation to generation. But within this consistency there is variation. Early handaxes from different sites show slightly different proportions. Over time, some regional styles emerge. Certain shapes are preferred in certain areas. This suggests not just copying of a template, but also a kind of cultural identity. Different groups, while sharing the basic handaxe technology, developed regional preferences and variations. This is culture in a meaningful sense, and there is another line of evidence for increasing cognitive sophistication. What appears to be aesthetic consideration in tool-making. Some of the finest Acheulean hand axes are so symmetrical, so perfectly proportioned, that they could not have been made more efficiently if they were made less symmetrically. The symmetry and beauty appear to exceed what function would strictly require. This suggests that the toolmaker was concerned not just with making a tool that worked, but with making a tool that was beautiful, that was pleasing to look at, that satisfied some aesthetic sense. This is a profound development. The ability to create something not because it is necessary, but because it is beautiful or because it carries some other meaning. This is fundamentally different from the kind of thinking that underlies simple tool use. And this suggests imagination. This suggests an inner life. This suggests the emergence of something we might call art. It's worth pausing here to consider what this might mean for the consciousness and inner experience of these ancient people. We cannot know what Homo erectus thought about or how they experienced the world. We cannot know if they were capable of what philosophers call phenomenal consciousness. The subjective experience of qualia, the what it is like to see red or feel pain or remember yesterday. But we can make some educated guesses based on their anatomy and the evidence of their behavior. Their brains were large and increasingly sophisticated. They engaged in cooperative hunting, which would have required planning and communication. They used fire, which would have allowed for new kinds of social activity in the evenings around the hearth. They created tools with aesthetically pleasing forms, suggesting some sense of beauty or meaning. It seems reasonable to conclude that Homo erectus was capable of something like complex thought, that they could remember the past, anticipate the future, communicate about abstract ideas, that they had emotions, fear when hunting dangerous prey, satisfaction after a successful kill, affection for their children and companions, perhaps even curiosity about the world around them. But we should be cautious about assuming too much. Their thought, almost certainly, was quite different from modern human thought. They probably lacked language as we know it, with its ability to express subtle shades of meaning and to refer to things that are not physically present. Their abstract thinking, while sophisticated for its time, was probably limited compared to what modern humans are capable of. They probably had no sense of history, no stories about their ancestors beyond perhaps a few generations back. They probably had no concept of their place in the cosmos, no religious or philosophical ideas in any sense that would be recognizable to us. What they had was the beginning, the foundation upon which all the later developments of human culture and civilization would be built. They had the neural and cognitive capacities for more sophisticated thought and communication than had existed before. And over the millions of years that followed, these capacities would be refined and expanded, eventually resulting in the full complexity of modern human consciousness and culture. Of all the technologies that humans developed in this long prehistoric era, there is one that stands above all others in its transformative power: fire. The control and use of fire by human ancestors is a question that has fascinated archaeologists and evolutionary biologists for decades. When did humans first learn to use fire? When did they learn not just to use it, but to make it? How did this technology spread? What did it mean for human development? The evidence is complicated and somewhat contested among scholars. There are hints of fire use dating back more than 1 million years. Burned bones found at archaeological sites, patches of soil that show signs of heating, but the clearest, most undisputed evidence comes from sites dating to roughly 600,000 to 400,000 years ago, where there are unmistakable signs of controlled use of fire, with hearths that show repeated use over time. Some researchers argue that evidence at certain sites suggests controlled fire use as early as 1 million years ago or even earlier, though this remains debated. What is certain is that by the time we reach the Middle Pleistocene, roughly 400,000 years ago, fire control was well established and widespread. But let us imagine the moment of first discovery, even though we know it was probably not a single moment, but rather a gradual process. Imagine an Homo erectus individual standing near the mouth of a cave during a lightning storm. Lightning has struck a tree outside the cave, and the tree is now burning. Fire spreads across the grass, moving toward the cave. Everyone panics, but then, as the fire approaches, something surprising happens. The predators that normally hunt the humans, the lions and hyenas and leopards, flee. They do not like fire. They fear it. It is a barrier that the predators are reluctant to cross. The fire reaches the cave mouth and then passes. It begins to die down, leaving blackened grass and smoldering wood. The smoke clears, and then carefully, one of the humans approaches the remaining flames and heat. A piece of burning wood lies on the ground. Carefully, this person picks it up. It is warm, it is light, it continues to burn as it's carried. This ancient fire carrier brings the burning wood back to the cave, back to the group. The fire is laid on some stones and dry branches are carefully placed on it. The fire catches, flames rise, heat spreads through the cave, and for the first time in human history, a group of humans has control over fire. Not accidentally, not temporarily, but controllable, repeatable fire that can be managed and used when needed. What this meant for human development cannot be overstated. Let us think through the implications. First, fire provides warmth. In the cold climates that Homo erectus was beginning to inhabit, the temperate zones of Eurasia, fire meant the difference between survival and death during long winters. Without fire, humans were essentially constrained to equatorial and tropical regions. With fire, humans could inhabit climates with real winters, with real seasonal variation. This opened vast new territories to human habitation. Second, fire provides light. Before fire, human activity was constrained by daylight. When the sun set, the night was essentially unlivable. Too dark to see clearly, too dangerous because of nocturnal predators. Fire pushed back the darkness. It created an island of light and safety in the night. This extended the productive day. It created a new social space where humans could gather, communicate, and rest safely. Third, fire is a tool for processing food. Raw meat is difficult to digest for human stomachs, especially in large quantities. But cooked meat is easier to digest and more nutritious. The proteins are more available, the calories are more easily extracted. Cooking meat therefore made it a more efficient food source. Additionally, many plant foods that are difficult or impossible to digest raw, including many nuts and seeds, can be eaten if they are cooked or heated. This expanded the range of foods that humans could consume. Fourth, fire provides a tool for hunting. Fires could be used to drive prey into places where they could be hunted. A savanna grassland, set on fire under controlled conditions, could force herbivores toward a ravine or a dead end where hunters waited. This is a kind of large-scale hunting strategy that would have required planning and coordination, but would have been extremely effective. Fifth, and perhaps most subtly, fire created a new kind of social space. Humans gathered around fires in the evenings. In this space, with warmth and light and security, a certain kind of social bonding occurred. Stories may have been told if storytelling existed. Emotions were shared. Hierarchies were negotiated. Skills were taught. The hearth became the center of human social life, and this had profound implications for the development of human culture and society. Imagine a night in a cave, roughly 500,000 years ago. The fire is burning in the center of the cave. Around it are gathered perhaps 30 humans of various ages. The children huddle against their mothers. The adults sit or lie on hides and grass arranged for comfort. The outer reaches of the cave are in shadow, the firelight not quite reaching them, but the heat and light from the fire extend throughout the shelter. The work of the day is over. The meat from yesterday's hunt has been processed and stored. Tools have been made and sharpened. Now, as darkness falls and the temperature drops outside, the group settles into the space around the fire. There is probably communication, we don't know its form, but people are gesturing, vocalizing, interacting in ways that cement social bonds. Perhaps someone is demonstrating a technique for making a sharper edge on a tool, teaching the younger people who watch intently. Perhaps there is play, children chasing each other in the firelight, their shadows dancing on the cave walls. Perhaps there is something like storytelling, one of the older members of the group recounting an event, perhaps the hunt from earlier in the week, acting it out with gestures and sounds. And through the night, the fire is maintained. Someone tends it periodically, adding wood, ensuring that it continues to burn. The fire becomes a responsibility, a shared task. This is a significant development in human society, the understanding that something valuable requires maintenance, that work in the present is necessary to maintain safety and comfort in the future. The maintenance of fire, the understanding of how to keep it burning, how to revive it if it goes out, how to manage it so that it is useful rather than dangerous. All of this required knowledge that had to be learned and transmitted. The fire had to be fed regularly. It had to be protected from moisture and wind. It had to be controlled so that it didn't spread beyond where it was wanted. This knowledge would have been jealously guarded, passed from experienced fire tenders to the young who were learning to perform this crucial task. Over time, fire making and fire use became routine. The burning wood from yesterday's fire could be carefully preserved and used to start tomorrow's fire. And then eventually, and we don't know how long this took, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years, humans learned to make fire themselves. The earliest possible evidence of intentional fire-making dates to roughly 100,000 years ago, though this is debated. What we can say is that once fire could be made reliably, a crucial threshold was crossed. Fire was no longer something that had to be found or scavenged, preserved from lightning strikes or volcanic activity. It could be generated whenever needed. This made fire a truly useful technology, no longer dependent on luck or circumstance. The cultural impact of fire was enormous. It changed the way humans lived, the rhythms of their days, the structure of their families and social groups. It changed the foods they could eat and therefore their nutrition and health. It changed the territories they could inhabit and therefore the range of the human species. Fire was in many ways the first truly transformative technology. As we move forward in time, the pace of change begins to accelerate slightly, though it would still be imperceptible if you were living through it. We are approaching a crucial threshold in human development, the emergence of anatomically modern humans, and more importantly, the emergence of behaviorally modern humans, humans whose way of thinking and acting was, in significant ways, like our own. The period known as the Later Stone Age or Upper Paleolithic, beginning roughly between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, depending on the region and the specific criteria used to mark the boundary, saw developments that, while not dramatic in any single generation, represent a cumulative shift that is remarkable when viewed across millennia. The tools became more sophisticated. The handaxes that had been dominant for more than 1 million years were gradually replaced by smaller, more specialized tools. Blades, sharp, thin pieces of stone struck from a prepared core, became more common. These blades could be hafted to handles made of bone or wood to create composite tools. A spear could now be made by combining a stone blade with a wooden shaft and some kind of binding material. The efficiency of hunting improved, the effectiveness of processing animals and plants increased, but more significantly, there is growing evidence of something beyond mere tool-making. There is evidence of art. In caves across Europe, Africa, and Asia, we find ochre, natural red and yellow pigments, that shows evidence of being used to paint or decorate objects. There are carved figurines, small sculptures depicting animals or in some cases stylized human forms. There are carved pieces of bone or antler decorated with geometric patterns. There are shells that have been pierced, suggesting that they were worn as ornaments or jewelry. This is a profound development. The creation of art, of objects that serve no survival function, that are made for aesthetic or symbolic reasons, suggests a level of symbolic thinking that goes beyond what earlier humans appear to have possessed. These objects suggest that humans were beginning to use material culture to express ideas, emotions, identities. They were creating meaning. They were leaving messages for themselves and for others. Archaeological sites from this period also show increasing evidence of burial practices. Earlier, humans apparently did not bury their dead, or at least there is no clear evidence of deliberate burial in most cases. But beginning roughly 100,000 years ago, there is growing evidence of bodies being placed intentionally in graves, sometimes with grave goods, tools, ochre, flowers, placed with them. This suggests a belief in an afterlife, a sense that death was not simply an ending but a transition. It suggests religious or spiritual thinking of a kind that is distinctly human. The evidence for this comes most clearly from sites in Europe and the Middle East, but there is growing evidence of similar developments in Africa and Asia. The pattern suggests that behaviorally modern human capabilities emerged in Africa first, perhaps as early as 100,000 years ago, and then spread to other parts of the world as human populations migrated. One of the most remarkable pieces of evidence comes from a site called Blombos Cave in South Africa, where archaeologists have found ochre pieces engraved with geometric patterns. These pieces, dated to roughly 100,000 years ago, show deliberate, carefully made patterns, lines and cross-hatching that suggest an intentional design. What was the purpose? We don't know. But the fact that someone took the time and care to create these patterns suggests that they held meaning. They were symbols. They were communication, even if we can no longer understand what they were communicating. Around 50,000 years ago, and particularly in the period known as the Upper Paleolithic in Europe, this pace of change accelerates noticeably. The archaeological record shows an explosion of new tools, new techniques, new forms of art. Figurative cave paintings appear in Europe around 40,000 to 45,000 years ago, remarkable images of animals painted on cave walls. Bone flutes appear, suggesting music. Sophisticated composite tools appear. From this point onward, human cultural development is rapid. Every few thousand years, new forms of art appear, new techniques are invented, new ways of organizing society emerge. What changed? Some scholars argue that there was a genetic change in the human brain, a final evolutionary step that gave modern humans their distinctive cognitive capabilities. Others argue that the capacity was already present but was only now being expressed, perhaps triggered by cultural or social changes. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The human brain, having evolved over millions of years to its modern size and configuration, was now beginning to tap into capabilities that had always been potential but had never been fully realized. Language almost certainly played a significant role in this transformation. While it's impossible to know exactly when language emerged, the fossil record and brain anatomy can only tell us so much. The evidence suggests that something resembling modern language, a system for representing arbitrary ideas using arbitrary sounds, a system capable of discussing abstract concepts and hypothetical scenarios, emerged sometime in this period, perhaps as early as 100,000 years ago, or perhaps only more recently, around 50,000 years ago. There is genuine scholarly debate about this timing. Language would have transformed human society in profound ways. It would have allowed for the transmission of complex information, the discussion of abstract ideas, the creation of shared meanings and narratives that could bind groups together. With language came the possibility of more sophisticated teaching. An experienced teacher could explain a technique to a student not just through demonstration, but through words describing the technique. Knowledge could be preserved and transmitted with much greater fidelity. Innovation could be built on previous innovation more effectively. The accumulation of knowledge could accelerate. And indeed, we do see evidence of acceleration from this point onward. New tools appear, new art forms appear, new strategies for hunting emerge. Different regions begin to develop their own distinctive cultures, their own ways of making tools, their own artistic styles. The stage is being set for the rapid cultural development that would eventually lead to agriculture, to civilization, to the world we know today. But even at 50,000 years ago, human society was still fundamentally based on small-scale groups living as hunters and gatherers. There were no cities, no states, no writing, no complex bureaucracies, but the foundations were being laid. The intellectual tools were being forged. Humans were developing the capacity for abstract thinking, for complex communication, for long-term planning and foresight, for symbolic expression and artistic creation. They were becoming, in every meaningful sense, us. As we approach the end of the last ice age, roughly 20,000 to 10,000 years ago, the world that humans inhabited was dramatically different from the world we know today. The ice sheets extended further south. The sea levels were lower by perhaps 400 feet, exposing land that is now underwater. And the animals were different, larger, more numerous, and more diverse than the fauna of modern times. Woolly mammoths, enormous shaggy elephants with curved tusks, roamed the grasslands of what is now Siberia and northern Europe. Giant ground sloths, the size of elephants, browsed in the forests of the Americas. Enormous wombat-like creatures called diprotodons walked the Australian landscape. Saber-toothed cats, the size of small bears, hunted across the continents. Giant armored glyptodonts, looking like enormous armadillos, plodded through South America. This was the age of megafauna, the age of giants. For hundreds of thousands of years, these giant animals coexisted with humans. Humans hunted some of them, scavenged from predator kills, and generally tried to avoid being eaten by them. But as human hunting technology improved, as human intelligence and social organization became more sophisticated, something changed. Humans became not merely another predator in the ecosystem, but the apex predator, the most effective, most coordinated, most intelligent hunter. The evidence for human hunting of megafauna is scattered through the archaeological record. Sites in Europe show the remains of woolly mammoths associated with human tools and evidence of butchering. Sites in North America show evidence of human hunting of giant ground sloths and mastodons. The bones are often broken and processed, suggesting that the animals were intentionally hunted and systematically butchered for meat. The hunting of megafauna was different from earlier hunting. These animals were massive, powerful, dangerous. A single error could result in death. Hunting them would have required sophisticated strategy, careful coordination, and probably involved significant risk. But the rewards were enormous. A single mammoth could provide meat for a large group for weeks or months. The bones could be used for tools, shelter, fuel. The hide provided material for clothing and shelter. The tusks were made of ivory, which could be carved into tools and art objects. To hunt animals of this size and power required a level of coordination and planning that we see clearly in the archaeological record from roughly 40,000 years ago onward. Sites show evidence of specialized kill sites, places where animals were driven and trapped. There is evidence of long-distance trading networks, suggesting large-scale cooperation between different groups. There is evidence of permanent settlements, base camps where large groups of people gathered for extended periods, particularly in areas rich in megafauna. The hunting of mammoth, in particular, shows signs of sophisticated strategy. There is evidence that hunters would drive the animals into natural traps, ravines or swamps where the animals would become stuck, or they would drive them toward hunters waiting in ambush. The process would have taken planning, communication, and coordination among many individuals. It would have taken not just intelligence but also bravery, because hunting a mammoth was almost certainly dangerous. People died in these hunts, but the megafauna provided such abundant resources that the risks were worth it. And as human hunting technology improved, as human populations grew, as human coordination and planning became more effective, the megafauna began to decline. This is one of the great mysteries and tragedies of the archaeological record, the extinction of the megafauna. The extinctions happened at different times in different places. In Africa, the megafauna had mostly disappeared by the end of the Pleistocene epoch, roughly 10,000 years ago. In Europe, the same timing. In North America, the extinctions happened a bit later, perhaps 11,000 to 10,000 years ago. In South America and Australia, the timing varied as well, but across all continents where megafauna existed, the pattern was similar. The arrival of humans or the intensification of human hunting coincided with the disappearance of the giants. The debate over the cause of these extinctions has raged for decades, and it remains contested among scholars. Some argue that climate change, the warming at the end of the Ice Age, was primarily responsible for the extinctions, as animals adapted to Ice Age conditions suddenly faced a rapidly warming world. Others argue that human hunting was the primary cause. The truth we now understand is probably that both factors played a role, and their relative importance probably varied in different places. But what is clear is that human hunting contributed significantly to the decline and eventual extinction of many of these species. What was the ecological impact of these extinctions? It was enormous. The removal of the herbivores that fed on grasslands and woodlands changed the vegetation patterns. Without mammoths and other megafauna to keep trees and shrubs in check, through their grazing and browsing, many grasslands transformed into forests. The vegetation landscape was fundamentally transformed. The predators that had evolved to hunt the megafauna, the saber-toothed cats, the giant hyenas, found themselves without sufficient prey and also went extinct. Entire ecosystems collapsed and were replaced by entirely new ecosystems. But for humans, the hunting of megafauna represented a triumph. It demonstrated that through intelligence and coordination and technology, humans could successfully hunt the largest, most powerful animals on Earth. It demonstrated that humans were no longer merely trying to survive in an ecosystem dominated by other predators. Humans were now the dominant predator, the animal that shaped the ecosystem through their hunting pressure. This had profound implications. Human populations could grow larger, supported by the abundant meat from megafauna. Human societies could become more complex, with some individuals specializing in hunting while others did different tasks. The accumulation of wealth in the form of stored meat and hides and bones became possible. And with accumulation of wealth came the possibility of inequality, of social hierarchies based on wealth and power. The stage was being set for the emergence of civilization. Around 12,000 years ago, in the fertile regions of the Middle East, known as the Fertile Crescent, something new began to happen. Humans started to deliberately cultivate plants rather than simply harvesting wild plants. They started to domesticate animals rather than simply hunting them. This was the Neolithic Revolution or agricultural revolution, and it would transform human society more profoundly than anything that had come before. But the agricultural revolution was not an invention in the sense of a sudden discovery. It was not as if someone sitting one day with a blank slate decided that farming would be a good idea and proceeded to implement it. Rather, it was a slow process that built on thousands of years of knowledge about how plants grew, how animals behaved, how food systems could be managed. For tens of thousands of years, humans had been gathering wild grains, nuts, and other plant foods. They understood, through long observation and accumulated experience, how plants grew, how and when they could be harvested, what conditions favored their growth. They understood which plants were edible and nutritious, which were poisonous, which had medicinal properties. They had, in other words, a sophisticated knowledge of botany and plant ecology, even if they didn't have words or formal systems for describing this knowledge. In the same way, humans had been hunting animals for hundreds of thousands of years. They understood the behavior of different animal species. They understood which animals were good to eat, how to track them, how to kill them. They understood, through long observation, the life cycles of animals, that females had offspring at certain times of year, that animals migrated seasonally, that young animals behaved differently than adults. The transition to agriculture began, it seems, not from a conscious desire to improve human life, or because hunting and gathering suddenly became unviable. Rather, it occurred gradually as humans in certain regions began to invest more effort in managing plants and animals that were already present in their environment. It was, in some sense, an intensification of practices that already existed. Picture a group of humans living in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East around 12,000 to 13,000 years ago. For thousands of years, their ancestors have been harvesting the wild ancestor of wheat, a grain that grows naturally in this region. Year after year, they harvest the ripe grain, process it by grinding the seeds and cooking them, and eat the resulting food. Now someone notices something. Seeds that fall near the village often grow next time the rains come. More plants grow near where they have been processing grain. What if someone might think, or might intuit without words? What if seeds were planted intentionally near the village? Whether the transition to planting was entirely intentional or happened gradually through a process of trial and error is unclear, but we know that it happened, and we know that once it happened, it accelerated. A few plants were planted. Some of them grew and produced seeds. Seeds were saved and planted again the next year. Over many generations, the plants that were saved for planting were those that produced the largest seeds, that were easiest to harvest, that grew most reliably. Gradually, through this process of unconscious selection, people were not deliberately trying to create new varieties, but simply saving the best seeds. The wild plant was transformed into a domesticated crop. The same process happened with animals. Hunting animals was dangerous and unpredictable, but animals kept near the village, penned or herded, could be controlled more easily. A woman pregnant with young would not need to be hunted because she could be kept alive and would eventually provide more offspring. A male with desirable traits could be bred selectively to produce offspring with those traits. Over many generations, wild animals were transformed into domesticated livestock. The earliest clear evidence of domestication dates to around 10,000 to 10,500 years ago. By this time, wheat and barley were being cultivated in the Fertile Crescent, and sheep, goats, cattle, and later pigs were being domesticated. In China, rice was being cultivated and pigs were being domesticated. In Africa, sorghum and other grains were being cultivated. In the Americas, agriculture developed independently, with corn being developed from its wild ancestor, teosinte. Agriculture was developing independently in multiple locations around the world, a sign that humans in different regions were discovering similar solutions to similar problems. What were the consequences of this transformation? They were profound and far-reaching, and not all of them were positive. On the positive side, agriculture allowed for the production of food surpluses. Unlike hunting and gathering, which tends to produce enough food to eat for the next few days or at most a few weeks, agriculture allows for the storage of grain or other crops for long periods. These surpluses could support people who didn't directly participate in food production: priests, rulers, soldiers, craft workers. Civilization as we know it would have been impossible without agricultural surpluses. Agriculture also allowed for larger populations. An area that could support 100 hunter-gatherers through wild plant and animal resources could support perhaps 1,000 people through agriculture. Population growth was often dramatic as agriculture spread. This growth brought more innovation, more specialization, more complex social organization. Agriculture also allowed for the accumulation of wealth. Unlike mobile hunter-gatherers who could not easily accumulate possessions beyond what they could carry, farmers had fields that had value, granaries of stored grain, herds of animals. Wealth could be accumulated, controlled, and passed to offspring, creating the possibility of inheritance and dynasties. It created the possibility of inequality on a scale that hadn't existed before. But on the negative side, agriculture was often much harder work than hunting and gathering. Clearing fields, planting, tending, harvesting, storing. These tasks were labor-intensive and required sustained effort over long periods. Skeletal evidence suggests that early farmers were actually less healthy than contemporary hunter-gatherers. They were often shorter, had more signs of malnutrition, showed more evidence of disease, and suffered more dental problems. Why would people choose this more difficult existence? Partly because agriculture, while more work, was more reliable. You couldn't guarantee that a hunt would be successful, but you could fairly reliably predict that if you planted grain and the rains came, you would have a harvest. In a world where unpredictable starvation was a constant threat, this reliability was valuable, partly also because agriculture allowed for population growth, and once populations were large and agriculture dependent, it became very difficult to go back to hunting and gathering. There were too many people to support through wild resources. But there was also a loss. The rhythm of life changed. Hunter-gatherers had significant amounts of leisure time. Ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherers suggest that they spend perhaps 15 to 20 hours per week acquiring food, leaving the rest of the time for rest, leisure, and socializing. Early farmers, by contrast, spent most of their waking hours working. There was less leisure, less freedom, less flexibility. And agriculture brought new problems. Populations that were dependent on a single or a few crops were vulnerable to crop failures. A drought could be catastrophic. A disease could wipe out an entire year's harvest. This created a kind of structural instability that hadn't existed in more diverse, mobile populations. Additionally, living in permanent settlements made humans more vulnerable to disease. In mobile hunter-gatherer groups, disease spreads are limited because populations are small and scattered. But in settled agricultural communities, populations were large and dense. Diseases spread more easily. The concentration of animals and humans in the same space created opportunities for new diseases to jump from animals to humans. Influenza, measles, tuberculosis, and many other diseases that would plague agricultural societies came from domesticated animals. And finally, agriculture enabled inequality and hierarchy in new ways. Surpluses could be controlled by a few people, but could be coerced or organized hierarchically. The accumulation of wealth and power became possible in ways that were not possible in more egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies. This set the stage for the emergence of rulers and ruled, of states and empires. And yet, once agriculture had begun, there was no going back. It spread like a slow-moving wave across the world. Different regions adopted it at different times. The Middle East, around 10,000 years ago, China and other parts of Asia, slightly later, Africa and Europe a few thousand years later, the Americas developing their own agricultural systems independently. Wherever agriculture took root, it transformed society. And everywhere it took root, it eventually led to civilization, to cities, states, writing, complex forms of government, and social organization. With agriculture came the possibility of civilization. The first cities emerged in Mesopotamia, the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now Iraq, around 3500 BCE or perhaps a bit earlier. Before this time, there were villages and towns, settlements of agricultural people living in relatively stable communities, but nothing we would recognize as a city in the modern sense. A city is a dense settlement with thousands or tens of thousands of people, with complex governance structures, with specialized craftspeople, and merchants and rulers, with monumental architecture, with a sense of urban identity distinct from the surrounding countryside. The city of Uruk is often cited as one of the first true cities. By around 2700 to 2600 BCE, Uruk had perhaps 40,000 to 50,000 people living in its walls or in its immediate vicinity, making it one of the largest settlements in the world at that time. The city had temples and palaces, evidence of a sophisticated religious and political hierarchy. It had craft workshops where tools and pottery and other goods were produced. It had markets where goods were traded. It had a defensive wall suggesting conflict with other settlements. It had what appears to have been an early form of government, with officials and administrators who kept records and made decisions. And here is the crucial threshold. With civilization came writing. Writing began, it seems, as an accounting tool, a way to keep track of goods, to record transactions, to manage the complex logistics of a city. The earliest writing we have, from Mesopotamia, and dating to around 3100 BCE, or slightly earlier, consists of marks on clay tablets representing numbers of goods and the names of the individuals responsible for those goods. These were not sentences, they were not narratives, they were accounting records. But once writing existed, it could be used for more than just accounting. Laws could be written down and thereby enforced more consistently. Religious texts could be recorded and preserved. Stories could be written and transmitted across generations without degradation through memory. History could be recorded. A permanent record of knowledge could be created. This is a crucial development because it marks the boundary between prehistory and history. Events before writing was invented are, by definition, prehistory. Events after writing was invented are history. But the distinction is more than just definitional. Writing allowed for a kind of accumulation of knowledge that was not possible before. Knowledge could be precisely recorded, could be consulted repeatedly, could be built upon. The pace of innovation accelerated dramatically. We are now at the end of our journey through the deep past, though really we have just reached a threshold, the great arc of human development, from the first upright apes wandering the African savanna 4 million years ago, through the invention of stone tools, through the mastery of fire, through the emergence of art and symbolic thinking, through the development of agriculture, to the founding of cities, and the invention of writing. This arc has led us to the moment when recorded history begins. And all of it, every bit of it, was made possible by that first innovation, the stone tool. Everything that follows is built on this foundation. Let us pause now and reflect on what we have witnessed in this long journey through time. We have traveled from 4 million years ago to 3,000 years before the Common Era, covering vast spans of development, of change, of innovation. And the thread that ties all of this together, the fundamental technology that enabled everything else, was the stone tool. A simple thing, really, a piece of rock shaped deliberately so that it has a sharp edge. And yet this simple thing changed everything. It changed what early humans could eat. It allowed them to access meat more efficiently, which provided nutrition that allowed their brains to grow larger. Larger brains allowed for more complex thinking. More complex thinking allowed for more sophisticated tools. Those tools allowed for even more complex activities. And round the spiral went, each innovation enabling new innovations, each advance creating the possibility for further advances. The stone tool was the first technology. Before it, there was trial and error, imitation, gradual learning through experience. But with the stone tool, there was something new. Deliberate design, the ability to visualize a goal and work toward it, the ability to transform materials according to an idea. This is technology in its truest sense, and technology, once it began, never stopped. From stone tools came bone and ivory tools. From these came weapons sophisticated enough to hunt megafauna. From hunting came the knowledge of ecology and animal behavior that made domestication possible. From domestication came agriculture. From agriculture came settlements, then cities, then states, then civilizations. From the need to manage the complex logistics of civilization came writing, and from writing came science, history, literature, all the achievements of recorded civilization. But there is another line of development that we should trace as well, the social and intellectual line. As tools became more sophisticated, they required more knowledge to make. This knowledge had to be transmitted from one generation to the next. Teaching emerged, culture emerged, language almost certainly emerged, though its timing and precise nature remain debated among scholars as a way of facilitating this teaching and communication. Art emerged as a way of expressing ideas and identity. Religion and ritual emerged as ways of binding communities together and making sense of the world. The stone tool, in other words, did more than change what humans could do. It changed what humans could think. It made possible forms of social organization that hadn't existed before. It made possible forms of meaning-making and expression. It created culture. And with culture came all the complexity of human existence, love and hate, creation and destruction, cooperation and conflict, meaning and absurdity. The stone tool did not make us human. Humans were human in many ways, long before tools. But it made us fully human in the sense of creating the possibility for all the forms of human achievement and all the forms of human tragedy that have characterized civilization since its beginning. When we look at a handaxe, that teardrop shape of worked stone, we are looking at a window into the minds of our ancestors, and we are looking at evidence that they could imagine something that didn't exist. We are looking at evidence that they could work toward a goal with patience and intention. We are looking at the first expression of human intelligence applied to solving a problem, to creating something useful, to transforming the world according to an idea, rather than simply accepting the world as it was given. And when we look at modern civilization, at our cities and technologies, at our sciences and arts, we are seeing, in a very real sense, the distant descendants of that first handaxe. The same capacity that allowed our ancestors to envision a sharp edge and create it through deliberate action allowed later humans to envision agriculture, to envision cities, to envision airplanes and computers and space exploration. The stone tool was the beginning. It was the first step on a path that has led us to where we are today. And understanding that path, understanding where we came from and how we got here, helps us understand who we are. We are not separate from nature. We are not fundamentally different from the creatures that walked the African savanna millions of years ago. We are their descendants. We carry their intelligence, their capacity for innovation, their ability to work together toward common goals. And we inherited these capacities through a long chain of development that began with something as simple as picking up a rock and shaping it to have a sharp edge. That act of shaping, of deliberately transforming a raw material into something useful and intentional, is the most fundamentally human thing we do. It is the root of all technology, all art, all culture. Every book ever written, every building ever constructed, every scientific discovery ever made, these are all descendants of that first handaxe. They are all expressions of the same capacity, the ability to imagine something that doesn't yet exist and to create it through deliberate action. And so we end where we began, in a sense, with a stone, with a tool, with the moment when human hands first learned to shape the world according to human will. That moment was not the beginning of humanity, but it was the beginning of everything that humanity would become. And so our journey through the deep past comes to an end. We have walked with our ancestors through the African savanna, watched them discover fire, seen them create art, seen them learn to farm, seen them build the first cities. We have traced the development of human technology and human culture from its simplest beginnings to the threshold of recorded history. But in a real sense, this journey never ends. We are still making tools, we are still imagining things that don't yet exist and creating them. We are still transmitting knowledge from one generation to the next. We are still creating meaning through art and symbol and story. We are still solving problems, still adapting to new environments, still cooperating and competing and building. The stone tool changed us, but we have never stopped changing. Innovation is part of what it means to be human. It is woven into our nature, shaped by millions of years of evolution and culture. Every problem we face, we try to solve. Every challenge we encounter, we try to overcome. That is our gift and our burden. That is what the first stone toolmakers gave us, not just a sharper edge, but a drive to continuously sharpen our understanding of the world, continuously improve our capacity to survive and thrive and create meaning. And perhaps that is a fitting place to end this story, not with a period, but with an ellipsis, because the human story continues. The tools continue to evolve, the technologies continue to change, the culture continues to develop. We are still in the midst of it, still writing the next chapter, still shaping the world according to our ideas and our hopes and our dreams. As you drift off to sleep tonight, listening to this story of stones and fire and the slow emergence of civilization, know that you carry within you all of this history. Your hands are the hands of the first tool makers. Your mind contains the intelligence that allowed them to imagine, to create, to transform the world. You are the inheritor of millions of years of human achievement and human struggle. You are part of a continuous chain stretching back to the African savanna and forward to whatever future awaits. Sleep well, and may your dreams be as rich and ancient as the history we share. If you enjoyed this journey through deep human history, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more immersive stories of the past. Leave a comment below and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I read every comment, and I always love hearing from our community around the world. Your questions and observations often inspire the topics for future episodes. Until next time, I'll be here in Whispers of Time, waiting to guide you through another corner of the past. Good night.